Okay, so I don't know if everybody tuned into our last session or whether they're new, so I would just say hello everyone, I am Becky Pearce, I'm a paediatric physio. Jenny has my contact details, so if at the end of this session there's any questions you have that you want to address privately, not on this forum, then I'm very happy to help. I run Hampshire Children's Physiotherapy, so if you wanted to Google that, you can get my contact details there. Whichever way, I'd be happy to help if I can, just to let you know. So our last session, we looked at the sort of foundations of movement, the principles of movement. We looked at head control. So we were looking at flexion. So we were talking a lot about anything that curls you into a ball. And we talked about so that's when you're lying on your tummy and anything that reaches up in the extension. So we were looking primarily at head control, which is one of the fundamental requirements for movement. But this week we are going to be looking at rolling, reaching and grasp. That's kind of the next stage on. Now, for rolling, reaching and grasp, you need the combination of using flexion and using extension to work together to create rotation. And rolling is actually a really quite complex movement. A normally developing child can take up to sort of 7-8 months to actually achieve rolling, so it is quite complicated. Rolling isn't learnt in isolation. As a child is learning to roll, they're also doing a lot of other movements. There's the supported standing, supported sitting. So it's not something that's learnt in isolation, but obviously today I'm just going to be focusing on the requirements for rolling and how that assists with hand development as well. So last session I did talk about what we need to be able to move and how movement is learned. So I won't recap all of that, but what I do want to cover is just to remind you of the 5 key principles that we need to learn movement, because I think they're really relevant when you're looking at your child and facilitating your child to learn a new movement, that you have these in mind. And I will be referring to them throughout the whole session, so I think it's important to remind ourselves of that. So the first one is strength. We need strength. We need to be able to use our muscles to move our limbs. So strength is really important. The next one is stability. So we can't move unless we have a stable base. So I do talk a lot about stability, especially with developing movement and child development. Stability is really important. So we talk about that. The other one is flexibility. So to be able to carry out a movement, you need to have the range of movement in the joints to be able to do that. So we've got strength, stability, range of movements, coordination. You need to be able to coordinate all your movements and put them together as one, and also purpose. Children will not learn a new movement unless there is a purpose to it. So those are the 5 key principles that we need to just bear in mind when we're looking at movement development. Okay, so let's look at rolling. So what do we need for rolling? I'm going to start off talking about development of flexion first of all. So we talked about this in last session, literally just talking about head control and talking about movement of head into flexion. This time we're going to be looking at the whole body and how this develops and leads to the development of rotation. So you'll start seeing, once your child has developed a little bit of stability and flexion, you'll start to see that they hold their head in the midline more often. Rather than it just randomly falling to either side, they're able to hold it in midline because they've got a little bit more stability. You'll also see that hands, they're made quite fisted, but hands will be more midline, more in the centre, and you'll see that movements are a little bit more symmetrical. Now, having said that, obviously if your child has a hemiplegia, so one side is working differently to the other, you won't see that symmetry. But obviously bearing in mind what we said about the principles of movement, if we've identified there's an asymmetry, we're going to be trying to working to gain that symmetry. So that's just something to be aware of. You might see hands moving to mouth, at this stage. But also another thing that is happening is as your child is lying on the back, we talked last time about physiological flexion, where you're really bent up into a little ball. But what's happening as the child gets a little bit older, gravity working down on the child will bring the arms open. So we'll stretch out some of these tissues across the chest and let these arms begin to open. At this point, the primary upper limb function that you're going to see is what we call horizontal flexion. So the arms will just be moving in this range of movement. And so swiping at toys. What's interesting to point out is that when a child is on their back, beginning to use their arms, hands to mouth, hands to knees, arms out, it's actually their development on their tummy that is allowing this extra stability in their shoulders. So I'll cover that in a minute. So although you're seeing they're practicing these movements when they're lying on the back, it's actually when they're working on their tummy that they're developing this strength. So it's important to note that. So we've got hands to midline, head's able to move side to side, keep in midline. We'll see these pec muscles, the big shoulder muscles on the chest getting stronger and allowing stability. Also the abs are starting to engage, so you're getting the whole stability in the trunk. So everything's a bit more stable there. Like I said, you need stability for movement. So if you've got all these muscles working, it allows movement of the limbs on a stable trunk and beginning to get that neck flexion coming. What you'll also see in this position is kicking of the legs. Your baby will probably be kicking their legs up and down and up and down. This is a fun activity, but it's also really important because every time your baby's kicking their legs up and down, they're mobilizing their pelvis. So as they kick their legs down, they're actually stretching out the muscles and the tissue between their rib cage and their hips. And also when they're coming up, they're crunching that up. So it's a reciprocal action, and you'll see that the pelvis is being mobilized and the muscles and tissues are being stretched. And obviously you need the mobility of the pelvis because that is required for rotation. So lots of kicking is actually really useful pelvic mobility activity. So if your child doesn't kick their legs, doesn't move their legs, then it's a really nice thing for you to do during play. Legs up and down, kicking up and down, just to sort of increase that mobility around the pelvis. You'll also see as stability improves in the trunk here, you'll see more isolated movements. So your baby might be able to bring their knees up to their chest, hold their knee there, and actually move the leg up and down because you've got enough stability here to stabilize the hip and getting a little bit more movement. So you'll see more isolated movements. And the same with the arms. They might begin to hold their arms at this point, and then you'll see elbow flexion, arm extension. So that stability in the trunk, stability at the hips allows more isolated movements to develop. Now, a really important movement in this lying position is tilting of the pelvis. So I did touch on it last time. I'm just going to tell my baby that way a little bit. So as these legs start kicking up and down, as this tummy gets stronger, you'll find that your child will be able to lift their bottom up off the ground. So you'll get what we call this posterior tilting of the pelvis. They're actually able to lift their bottom up off the ground. So obviously when this is happening, your children will be more interested in what's going on here. You might see hands coming to knees, hands coming to feet, and they're working in this little ball position. Okay, so you're getting that posterior tilt of the pelvis. Now you can see if you're in this position, what you might get, there we go, is a little accidental roll happening because your child able to come up into a little ball, tilting their pelvis back, a little bit unstable, and you get a roll. Now that is how rolling basically starts. So your child will do a roll and actually think, oh, that was quite good fun. and repeat it over and over and over again. And that is key to learning a new movement. Children will repeat movements for the pure pleasure of it, repeat over and over again and learn that movement and learn how to take on that movement independently. And so children who need a little bit of help repeating movements, something they can't do, that's what you as parents can offer, that repetition. So you're facilitating that movement over and over and over again until the pathways are laid down and they're learning that movement. So that's what we're seeing, that little posterior tilt of the pelvis. So as again that core becomes stronger, you might see that your child is actually able to lift their head up in isolation. So they're not tucking up their knees, they can leave their hips down and they can bring their head up themselves. You won't see that full sit for a long time yet, but they might be able to have that little chin tuck. And also you might see that posterior tilt of the pelvis in isolation by itself without the chin tuck. So they have the stability in their trunk to be able to bring bottom up and head down. So that whole flexion is developing. What you also see once the child gets a little bit stronger is that the development they gain in extension, so on their tummy, they can actually start using when they're on their back. So remember, extension is everything against gravity when you're lying on your tummy. So it's shoulders up, hips extended. So what you might begin to see, you've got a little bit of flexion at the knees. You might end up having feet on the floor and the bottom lift. So what we see is a little bridge. So that's actually extension. So it's not the flexion we've been talking about. It's actually the opposite, it's extension. But they're getting so strong that they can use that extension to do a little bridge. Now, with that position, you might see a single leg extension. So one leg's down, one's up, and you get a little bridge happening. And what can happen with that little bridge is, whoa, I've pushed too far and I've rolled over. So that is another way that rolling can develop. If you see your child with their foot on the floor, lifting up, that can be the start of a roll. Also, you might see your child begin to start pivoting on the floor. So if they've got feet on the floor and they're pushing backwards, you might see a sort of backward shuffle. So they're moving around in a circle. So you might have put your child down, come in, they're still on their back, but they've moved. You think, how have they done that? So that's the development of extension, when they've had feet on the floor, lifting their bottom up and just push themselves around. So that's, again, homing in on the fact that movement isn't developed in isolation. So it's not just flexion, they're learning the skills. So when they're on their tummy, the skills they've learned on their tummy can be used on their back as well. So it's not an isolated development, it's all working together to help this rolling. Anything else I need to cover on flexion? I think that has covered most things on flexion. So you're seeing stability in the trunk, more isolated movement, hands coming to midline, hands coming to knees, feet. You're seeing that whole body flexion, and you might see an accidental roll using a little bit of extension for an accidental roll. So those are all the things you need in flexion to develop that rolling pattern. So at the end of this session, well, the second half of the session, I'll be showing you practical ways to work on that. So I'm just showing you here what you actually need, skills you need to be able to carry out that movement. So, opposite one, we're going into extension. So, tummy lying. So I hope you can see, move back a little bit so you can see my baby on the floor. There we go. So on the tummy, what are we seeing happening on the tummy? So to start with, you've got a baby that doesn't like, or a child that doesn't like being on their tummy because they've used to being in this little ball. So being on the tummy requires a lot of work, but you'll begin to see a little bit of head lift happening as the muscles get stronger. And at this point, I'll point out that vision is a really good stimulator for children, and they will really, the only reason they'll want to lift their heads up in this position is to look at something, so have something really exciting in front of them. Obviously, if your child has visual impairment, you'll need to use noise or textures or something else, and that you need to be aware of that, because vision is a big trigger and a stimulus for development in tummy lying. So you'll see a little bit of that head lift. You might begin to see a little bit of turning of the head. And as the child turns the head, the weight will go to the same side that their head is turning to. Okay, in that position. You'll see arms come forwards a little bit. And as I said in our last session, at this stage, weight is very much forwards on the head, not on the feet. It's forwards on the body. So by anchoring down, it's easier to lift the head. So as a child's arms become a little bit further forward, that shifts their weight towards their feet, down towards the end of their body, and makes it much easier to lift their head up. So as arms come forward, head will become easier to lift up. Also, what you'll see about 3 months in a normally developing child is something called the Landau Reflex. And that's when you hold the child on their tummy, you'll see them lift their head, their arms and their legs up against gravity. So if your child's been able to do that, you'll see when they're on their tummy, they will begin to do what we call an aeroplane position. So head up, arms up, and this really helps with the development of extension. But if your child's had difficulty with that reflex, then you'll need to help them with it. You'll need to really encourage this tummy line, because it will be effortful for them to move up against gravity. So that Landau reflex has really helped lift head up against gravity. Now, as I said last time, the child initially has a real curved spine. It's a C shape, not like the adult spine. It's a lovely S shape that allows good weight bearing for walking, standing. They have quite a C shape back. So by lying on their tummy, you can see that that would have been the C shape back. But when the head comes up, you get a little curve in the spine here, and you can see that how that influences, even in my doll, extension of the pelvis here. So you're beginning to see those lovely curves in the spine develop, which is really important in the neck and in the bottom of the back. So that tummy line is essential to develop those curves in the spine. So to start with, movements will be quite quick. It'll be a quick head lift, and a flop down, because it's hard work. Quick head lift, flop down. But then you'll see all these lovely muscles in the back get a little bit stronger, and you'll see that the child can actually lift the head up for longer periods of time, and showing a lot more stability in the muscles down the back. So as this improves, you'll see that the glutes, so the big bottom muscles that help hip extension, will start to develop, and they will stabilize. And when these muscles here are anchoring the pelvis down, it's much easier to bring the arms forward and to bring the head up, because there's something really stabilizing down here. So the glutes will act as a strong stabilizer, and you'll find that your child can come up on their forearms. Now that forearm prop position is really, really important for the development of hand skills. It's stretching out the muscles in the forearm and the wrist. They start off quite flexed and bent, and this forearm prop really releases those muscles. So it's important that you allow your child to have time in this forearm prop position, opening up those muscles. Also starts to activate the muscles around the shoulder, which stabilize the shoulder and allow, as I talked before, this movement when they're on their back. If they've got stability in their shoulder girdle, and that is developed from this forearm prop position. Okay, now once they have spent some time in this position, which has stretched out their hips as well, because remember their hips are quite flexed to start with, so being on their tummy will stretch out the muscles and the tissues in the front of the body there, and allow that extension of the spine. So once they've got that flexibility in their back, they've got that strength in their glutes and their bottom muscles, you might see and start to push up on straight arms. Difficult to do on my doll here. And straight arms. Imagine those are straight arms. And what you might see at that point, when up on straight arms, you might do a little bit of toppling and overbalancing and a roll. And again, that's one of the ways that rolling is developed. I just forgot to mention forearm prop, what you might see as well in that position. When the child turns the head, the weight will be transferred onto the supporting arm and it frees this arm up for a reach. So you'll see a little bit of rotation and then we can get reach on the other side. So if your baby's lying on their front, putting something in front of them to reach, transfer the weight, reach, and what can happen there? A roll. So you can see how it all leads on to rolling. Anything else I need to say in prone? No. So you've got the extended arm position and that will lead to a roll. And every time your child sort of accidentally does a roll, they're stretching all those muscles along the back, which is helping for development in other positions as well. So it's a really important developmental stage. So I've done my time there. We've done 20 minutes. So that, in a nutshell, really, is the movements that you need to be able to roll. So it's the development you've got in flexion and the development you have in extension, to be able to combine the two to create that rotation and roll. So that's what you need for the movement. So if anyone's got any questions with regards to that section of the talk today, let me know, and then we will go on to looking at maybe looking at the children who might have low tone or high tone or asymmetry and ways we can help them develop movement. So any questions so far?